Ladies and gentlemen, we've got a spooky one today. If you're a fan of Puppet Combo or even just my channel, I'm sure you're aware of the game called Night Watch. To refresh your memory, Night Watch sees you playing as a park ranger named Jim. In the game, you are assigned a watchtower where you are tasked to live on your own and spend your days looking out for any issues in hopes to prevent any wildfire from breaking out. Everything is fine and dandy up until around the middle of the game, where you start receiving weird radio calls, either from campers claiming to hear some creature or even the weird sounding creature itself. That is until near the end of the game, where you venture out of your post to investigate some distressed campers, only to find yourself getting yoinked by the driller killer, where you ultimately meet your fate, chained up in a metal cage in some abandoned industrial factory out in the middle of nowhere where you'll probably never be found ever again. Yeah, that's pretty scary actually, now that I think about it. Well, as it turns out, something like this may have actually happened in real life. And to be honest, the story behind it is a lot more scary and haunting than the game itself. My friends, sit back and relax as we talk about the disappearance of Stephanie Stewart, a fire lookout scout who met a similarly eerie fate as Jim, and how Puppet Combo might have been influenced by this disappearance/homicide case. If you're like me, you probably love a good criminal case, not because of anyone who died or were affected or who were injured, but mostly because of the interesting details and events that led up to said case. I say this because although in the video I may come off joking and lightheartedly, that couldn't be further from the case. I have the utmost respect for not only Stephanie Stewart, but also her friends and family who had to endure such a traumatizing, mysterious, and unexplainable case. With that being said, let's go over to what happened to Stephanie Stewart on the night of August 26, 2006, where she vanished from her outpost in Alberta, Canada, never to be seen again. Like Jim from Night Watch, Stephanie Stewart was a fire spotter who manned the Athabasca Fire Lookout Tower all by herself, one of the 100, or I should say 128, lookouts scattered throughout the province of Alberta. I say 100 now because the number of towers seem to have gone down since 2006. Stephanie was described as an accomplished outdoorsman who loved her job as well as crafts, gardening, and reading. It is to be mentioned that prior to this, she had climbed Mount Kilimanjaro, a dormant volcano described as the highest mountain in Africa and the highest freestanding mountain above sea level in the world, clocking in at approximately 5,895 meters above sea level. She had also biked across Canada too, like what the fuck? I mentioned all of this to sort of paint a picture of who this woman was. She wasn't just some random inexperienced lady who took up this job for no reason. She lived and breathed nature, exploring, and survival. I'd like to point out also that at the time of her disappearance, she was 70 years old. What a beast this woman was. I'm like less than a third of her age and I couldn't even last 10 minutes out in the wilderness, let alone the months on end that not only her but other fire spotters and lookouts, have to do during their summer months. Even the RCMP, aka the Royal Canadian Mounted Police, determined Stephanie to be a healthy and adventurous senior. She was an experienced fire spotter who spent many summers living in the bush. Their words, not mine. On August 26, 2006, an employee of the Wildlife Service was sent out to the cabin in which Stephanie resided in, a task brought about due to Stephanie's failure to report the weather that morning. You see, it is a part of a fire spotter's job to record and report the weather throughout the day. They do this as it helps predict and prevent wildfires. For example, a dry and warm weather condition could lead to a higher risk of a fire breaking out, as opposed to if it rained a lot. These are all things that fire spotters should be looking out for and reporting back, and that was part of Stephanie's duty as well. Although it was quite uncommon for a fire lookout scout to miss a report, what this employee would end up finding inside of the cabin was nothing more than disturbing and haunting. Before the employee had even entered the cabin, it was noted that Stephanie's gray pickup truck was still parked right outside the cabin, and even more haunting, leading up to the cabin on the porch itself were spots of blood scattered throughout. Upon entering the cabin, there was a pot of boiling hot water on the top of the stove with the burner on full. Nearly all the water in the pot had evaporated, indicating the stove had been left on for quite some time. 2 pillows, a bedsheet, a comforter, and a gold watch were also discovered to be missing from inside the cabin as well during later investigation. Most importantly, Stephanie Stewart was nowhere to be found, leaving no traces or clues as to where she had gone or how this had happened. Initially, the Royal Canadian Mounted Police ruled Stephanie as a victim of an animal attack. However, once a conservation officer arrived and meticulously combed through the area for any indication of wildlife involvement, the possibility of an animal attack was swiftly dismissed. Despite thorough and repetitive investigation of the area, no traces of animal hairs, prints, or droppings were ever found, leading to the conclusion that wildlife was not responsible for Stephanie's disappearance. The very next day, on August 27, 2006, detectives and forensic investigators from the RCMP Major Crimes Unit deemed Stephanie a victim of a kidnapping and concluded that she was likely forcefully removed from her cabin and murdered.
RCMP determined she was likely the victim of a homicide. A search at the time came up with no answer.
So you might be asking, Blind, what the fuck does this have to do with Puppet Combo and Night Watch? So let me explain, hold on. To start off with the obvious, both Stephanie and the main character of Night Watch were both fire spotters who were tasked to live alone in the middle of the woods as part of their duty as park rangers. Furthermore, in the eyes of the public, one day both of them just randomly disappeared, never to be seen again, with the explanation that they were probably kidnapped. Of course, the difference is that Night Watch actually shows us what happened to the victim, as with the Stephanie Stewart case, we can only imagine and try to piece together what happened on that tragic day. Another point of similarity between both concepts I'd like to point out has to do with the environment and setting. If you remember from earlier, the Stephanie Stewart case took place in Alberta, Canada, and more specifically around a town called Hinton. Hinton is surrounded by thickly forested rolling hills and mountains for at least 100 kilometers in all directions, punctuated by maybe the occasional sawmill or mine. No population centers exist within 80 road kilometers of Hinton. This mirrors the setting from Night Watch, which takes place in the Pocono Mountains, a large area that also boasts massive amounts of forest and mountainous land. I would also like to place emphasis on the punctuated maybe by the occasional sawmill or mine, and no population centers exist within 80 road kilometers of Hinton, as it reminds me heavily of the driller killer and his habit of seeking shelter in abandoned factories, sawmills, and houses, just like the one we find in Power Drill Massacre. I don't know, something about both taking place in a part of the forest far away from civilization, and the fact that both either imply or directly show that there are abandoned sawmills and buildings in the surrounding area, it just pulls both of these concepts that much closer. My last point of parallels between the two simply come from the ending and outcome of the game Night Watch itself. As we all know, the reason Park Ranger Jim even left his watchtower in the first place was because of a call he received from campers who were in distress and worried about a potential threat. This caused Jim to set out and travel on foot to the supposed campsite, only to find blood, clothing, and belongings scattered along the path and in the campsite itself. Is this possibly what happened to Stephanie? Was she manipulated by some unknown force to leave her cabin? Was she lured by someone or even a group of people who manipulated her and misled her? Of course, I don't really know if these cabins had radios that people could just tune in and communicate to park rangers. And of course, most importantly, that does not explain how and why only Stephanie's blood was found in the cabin. But, you know, it's just some food for thought. So you guys probably might be wondering, Blind, what do you think happened? What do you think happened on August 26th? Where did Stephanie go? So let me, at least give my input. Obviously, I'm just a guy on the internet who's just reading stuff and reading articles and reading about, what exactly happened with the information that was given by not only police, but, people like the employee who was there. I still would like to give, my conclusion on what I think happened. And just hear me out. So everything is normal, right? Stephanie was doing her job, everything's going fine, everything's normal. And at some point, someone forcefully entered their way into her cabin. I'd like to mention that these cabins and lookout towers are so extremely isolated. I don't think you guys understand. Like sometimes the distance between one cabin or lookout tower to the next is tons and tons of meters or even kilometers. And people know that, and someone probably took advantage of that and knew that there weren't going to be people around, or people were going to be fast enough to notice her gone just because of how far she was. So yeah, so they attacked her, hurt her, left her blood there obviously because of the attack, but since they, intruded and stuff, they didn't really get hurt. It was more of a surprise attack, I feel like. That's why there was no blood of anyone else, because the other person probably, wasn't hit by anything. It was a quick job or something. I don't even know. Once they neutralized her, they dragged her out and took her to some undisclosed location. I don't have no idea where. Like I said, my conclusion, I feel like, could be like literally like what the driller killer did. It could be in an abandoned factory, abandoned sawmill like the article mentioned, or an abandoned home. It's a large area of just nothingness, of forest and darkness, so you can only imagine the locations that someone could hide a body over there. And I think that's unfortunately what happened to Stephanie and why her remains were never found. I also want to say, so before leaving, they set the stove to full and left the pot of water on top of the stove while the burner was on full in hopes to burn down the place. I actually think that pot of water that the employee found was actually an attempt by the intruder to burn down the place, burn down the evidence, That's why they placed a pot of hot water, maybe to try to make it seem like an accident. I don't think they were expecting help to arrive to Stephanie's cabin that quick. So like I said, I think it was like an inside job. They were just trying to, leaving that burner on full was an attempt to burn down the cabin, was just to leave it on full, and the gas would eventually, and the fire would eventually come out and burn everything down. And finally, like Night Watch, like I mentioned earlier, Stephanie's body or whatever was probably taken to some abandoned sawmill or something and was never found ever again. That's honestly what I think happened to Stephanie. Obviously, it's very horrible what happened. I wish I could say that's not what happened. But who knows? Obviously, you guys can come up with your own conclusions too, and I would love to hear them. So just comment down below what you guys think happened to Stephanie. I forgot to mention earlier that prior to this, Stephanie had 13 years of experience at the station she was working at, where she started her work in 1993. This woman was no joke. She knew what she was doing. She had the years to back it up. She did not just randomly decide to run away or somehow wasn't able to keep herself alive, She was wrongfully targeted and attacked by some dickhead and didn't deserve to go out the way she did. I'm just being straight up. She seemed like a nice woman who just loved nature. She absolutely did not deserve to go out how she did. In the end, both stories are tragic and involved an innocent person who was wrongfully taken and murdered for simply doing what they loved when it came to exploring, understanding, and surviving nature. Of course, I don't mean to compare both to being equally as tragic, as one is a video game and the other is a real life fucking homicide case. Again, I like to mention I by no means am downplaying or trying to make light of the situation. It's a horrible thing what happened on August 26th, and I'm pretty sure that's something everybody can agree, and myself included. I hope me comparing it to a video game does not come off as rude or disrespectful. I simply thought it'd be cool to potentially find the sources of inspiration of puppet combo games, and out of the whole catalog, Night Watch is probably the closest and most obvious connection to a real world event. That's all I got for you guys. Remember to stay safe, my friends, and I hope you all have a beautiful day. Peace out.